So, as we discuss all the Europeans who are coming and settling in the Americas, we must also talk about the first people to migrate to and settle in the Americans, groups of people that we now know collectively as the Native Americans. Now, common theory holds, and I think we've all kind of heard this before, that theory holds that there was once a land bridge connecting um, Asia and the Americas through what's now the Bering Sea, and that was all frozen over. They followed wild game to that took this route, taking them all the way down into North America. The best evidence we have of this is actually the Arlington Springs Man, who is actually the Arlington Springs Lady. The human remains discovered on Santa Rosa Island dates back to about 13,000 years ago. This is right off our coast. Here's us. Some of the oldest human remains are actually found off our coast. And this gives pretty good evidence that, the earliest human remains along the west coast, which would mean that they probably traveled from via this land bridge. I had a professor that said they all sailed here. Don't necessarily know that to be true. I'm not sure if he had much evidence of it, but most people attribute the land bridge. So it's impossible to go into all of these Native American tribes, all of them unique in their own way, their own culture, their own system of living and things like that. So the best we can do is make a few general statements about these groups of Native Americans. First off, extensive trade networks all throughout the Americas. So they were very well connected to each other. And they traded goods from one tribe to the next. So they weren't necessarily, simple, small villages living off the land or anything like that. Beyond that, they had very organized living structure. As you can see in this image here of agriculture, living quarters, and this out here is depicted as like an outhouse. Concepts of sanitation that didn't even really exist in Europe at the time. So fairly organized, and especially when you start thinking about the Aztecs and the Incas in South America, very, very organized living structures. And beyond that, they had they had very advanced forms of government. For instance, here, the Iroquois Constitution, which connected the Iroquois Empire on the east coast of the United States. A lot of their concepts written in this Iroquois Constitution was actually adopted by authors of the Constitution, authors of our form of government. So in a lot of ways, they were very well connected, organized, and sophisticated in their living habits. Now, when we discuss the settlement of Europeans and the meeting of the Native Americans, each one of these different empires have a little bit different interaction with the Native Americans. So let's start with Spain. Spain, hate to say it, mostly negative experiences. There are not a whole lot of positive things that come from interactions with Spaniards, the conquistadors, and the Native Americans. It's mostly a story of conquest and plunder, the pursuit of gold. Francisco Pizarro and Cortez in the Aztec Empire and the sacking of the Aztec Empire. There's quite a lot of quite a few stories of conquest and plunder, and it resulted in a lot of violence and a lot of loss of life. Beyond that, the missions, the Catholic missionaries had the absolute best intentions for what they were trying to accomplish, and they definitely wouldn't classify it as slavery, but the system that they set up in the missions um, probably felt like slavery to the Native Americans, and the fact that they were really restricted from leaving if they wanted to. Um, Spain, not a whole lot of great events to come from their interaction with the Native Americans. The French, probably the most positive experience and experiences comes from interactions with the French and Native Americans. And that really goes back to their purposes for being in the Americas. They didn't want to set up any territories or permanent residences. They were really only there to establish trading networks. And the Native Americans were very sophisticated in their trading networks. And the French fit in really well with this. So they actually had a lot of really positive experiences. There's even stories of excuse me, French settlers who intermarry with the Native Americans and become almost as adopted into these Native American tribes. There's only a few examples of violence between the French missionaries and the Native Americans. And for the most part, that was actually on behalf of the Native Americans. And it was the French missionaries who lost their lives. So, all in all, the French probably have the best track record when it comes to the history of their dealing with Native Americans. England, it varies a little bit more. It's kind of hard to pin them down and say, well, yes or no. There are occasionally times of great collaboration and friendship between the Native Americans. After all, that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. The celebration of the harvest with the Native Americans. But occasionally there are instances of fighting with the Native Americans as well, especially in Jamestown. Jamestown got off to a really rocky start, and they didn't make very good friends with the Native Americans initially. Now, the overall impact on the Native Americans, as it states in a book called A People's History of the United States, it really is not a pleasant story. It's a story of enslavement, uh, especially in the Caribbean. When you start thinking about sugarcane and harvesting sugarcane, a lot of the Native Americans were enslaved to harvest sugar. Excuse me. Uh, Disease as well, the smallpox virus, which they had never been exposed to before, so therefore it wiped out almost entire civilizations. Death estimates range. It's really hard to say exactly how many people died or what percentage of a population died, but it very well could be up to 90%, somewhere between 80 and 100 million Native Americans dying from disease as a result of interaction with the Native Americans. And lastly, the loss of their ancestral lands, and this is a theme that we'll study for many months to come as we talk about westward expansion and the impact that has on the Native Americans. So something to keep in mind of as we study U.S. history is the original Americans, the first people to settle here, and the somewhat unpleasant stories of what resulted from the expansion of the European civilization.